They flew me out with barely 2 days' notice. No explanations, no official mission briefing, just a classified itinerary marked with my ID clearance, and a one-way flight to an unnamed naval outpost off the coast of Guam. I've been in the Navy long enough to know when not to ask questions. Still, something about this deployment felt wrong from the moment I stepped on the tarmac. The air was heavy, not just with humidity, but with something less tangible. A tension that seemed baked into the concrete, lurking between the hangars, watching from the shadows of the supply crates stacked too neatly in rows. I've taken on covert salvage missions before, crashed drones, downed satellites, sunken recon ships. All high stakes, but never quite like this. This one didn't even come with a code name. Just a whispered call sign among the staff. Operation Mako. No one ever said it out loud when officers were near. I was briefed by a civilian in a suit that didn't fit. He handed me a dossier with exactly 3 items inside. A grainy sonar scan, a short excerpt from a 1943 U.S. Navy manifest, and a hand-drawn depth chart with a location marked in red that didn't match any known charted trench. It was never supposed to be found, he said, his voice like sandpaper. But the ocean gave it back. I asked him what it was. He just looked at me with a kind of tired sorrow, like someone who had seen too much but couldn't talk about any of it without splintering in half. He told me we'd be working with a private recovery contractor, but that I was the ranking military officer on the op. That was unusual. I'm no officer, not technically. I'm just good at what I do. Diving, entering wrecks, and staying alive inside places that weren't meant for the living anymore. We boarded the recovery vessel at midnight, under moonlight barely strong enough to cut through the mist. The crew didn't talk much. One of the deckhands looked at me, pale as bone, and said, "I hope you don't believe in ghosts." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. The ship's name was blacked out. No flag, no numbers. Like it was trying to forget its own identity. The dive site was 500 nautical miles from land. We reached it in a little over a day. Nothing visible on the surface, just an expanse of empty water stretching in every direction. But the sonar confirmed it. There was something down there. And not just anything. A submarine, upright, perfectly preserved, resting on a ledge over the Mariana Trench like it had parked there for a brief stop and never left. The USS Mako, according to the manifest. Last recorded transmission, June 4th, 1943. Presumed destroyed. No wreckage ever found. Until now. I suited up before sunrise. The dive prep was standard, but I couldn't shake the sensation that I was being prepped for something else entirely. One of the ROV pilots muttered a prayer over his controller. Another handed me a wristband with a tracking chip and said, "Just in case she doesn't let you go." I laughed nervously, but he didn't smile. I asked him who she was. He just stared at the water and said, "The ship." The descent took 14 minutes. The water closed in quickly, pressure tightening around me like a second skin. Below the 100-meter mark, it went from dark to darker. At 300 meters, light stopped altogether. That's when the shadow came into view. Massive, black, elegant in the way old war machines often are. The hull of the Mako gleamed faintly under the submersible's floodlights. No corrosion, no breach. The forward torpedo tubes still sealed. The propellers were motionless, pristine. A ship frozen in time. We latched onto the top hatch, and I slid inside. The airlock hissed, then opened like it had been waiting. Inside, I expected rot, water damage, rust. But there was none. The interior was dry. The floor beneath my boots solid and unworn. The light fixtures, decades out of date, flickered weakly to life on their own. My breath caught in my throat. It felt like stepping into a museum exhibit. Only everything was too real. The maps on the walls hadn't yellowed. The pencils on the command desk weren't cracked. There was even a mug of what looked like coffee, half full, resting beside an old logbook dated June 3rd, 1943. I opened the book, thumbing through faded entries. The ink was still legible. The last entry read, "We've gone too far. The signal came from below. I fear we've woken it." I was not alone in the sub. That was my first certainty. Not because I saw anyone, but because the silence felt occupied. I could hear the faint hum of systems that should have died decades ago. I could hear dripping, not from water, but from something slower, thicker. Oil, maybe. Blood, possibly. I moved slowly down the corridor, my camera streaming everything to the surface team. They said nothing in my earpiece. I began to worry they weren't even watching. As I passed the crew quarters, something shifted in the corner of my eye. A movement, fleeting, just beyond the edge of certainty. I turned fast, but there was nothing. Still, the smell of old sweat, tobacco, and metal filled the space like the memory of a life lived hard and fast. Then came the sound. Not a bang or groan. Something simpler. The sound of a breath. One, deep and rattling. Not mine. It came from below. The lower deck. I wasn't supposed to go deeper yet. Protocol was to mark areas of interest and report them before descending. But my feet moved without permission, drawn by something I couldn't name. I passed the galley, plates still set, one chair pulled back, and found the ladder down to the lower compartments. The rungs were cold. The air got denser with each step. My lights flickered. Something brushed my ankle. I told myself it was debris. I didn't look down to check. The lower deck was darker, narrower, like the walls had drawn in since the last time someone walked them. I found engineering controls still active, gauges twitching faintly. A soft hum throbbed through the metal. It didn't sound electrical. It sounded organic, like the sub was breathing. I paused, hand on the bulkhead, and felt warmth. Not heat from machinery, body warmth, as if something had just moved away. I marked the area and began to climb back. But at the base of the ladder, someone had scratched words into the metal. Letters uneven, gouged in haste. Stay with her. The rest was smeared with rust. As I ascended, my hand gripped a rung covered in something sticky. I lifted my glove. Red. Not fresh. Not old. Just recent enough to still be warm. When I surfaced and climbed back onto the support ship, the others didn't meet my eyes. One of them asked quietly, "Did she speak to you yet?" I didn't answer. Because I think she did. That was the beginning. The moment everything shifted. I should have walked away. But instead, I signed on for another dive. I didn't sleep after the first dive. I don't even think I blinked more than a few times between midnight and dawn. I just sat in the cramped bunk of the recovery ship, staring at the metal ceiling and listening to the rhythm of the ocean against the hull. There's a sound the sea makes when it doesn't want you there. A low, persistent pressure like it's holding its breath around you, waiting for you to leave. Or drown. That's how the water felt now. Like it was watching. No one came to debrief me. No clipboard. No formal psych eval. Just silence from the upper deck and one cold meal tray left outside my door. The kind of silence that isn't neglect, but denial. Like they were hoping that if they ignored what I saw, maybe it wouldn't follow us back. I replayed the footage over and over. The camera feed from my dive helmet hadn't glitched. It had captured everything. The pristine hallways, the active gauges, the glint of the coffee cup in the captain's quarters that steamed for just a moment when I touched it, as if my presence disturbed something still warm beneath the surface. And more disturbingly, the motion, that shape caught in the far left quadrant of frame 2128, frozen between one hallway and the next. A figure, uniformed, human, staring directly into the lens for less than a second before vanishing into the black. It hadn't moved like a ghost. It moved like someone who knew exactly where they were, and didn't want to be seen. At 0700, the intercom crackled and a voice called me to the bridge. When I entered, Commander Raleigh was waiting. He had a face like melted stone, hard and smooth and unreadable, and he didn't look up from the screen he was monitoring. He didn't ask how I was. He didn't ask what I'd seen. He just tapped the sonar image in front of him and said, "She's still powering something." I moved closer. There, in the bottom right corner of the 3D scan, was a pulse. Faint, but rhythmic. Power draw measured in waves. Something beneath the Mako was pulling energy from its systems. Or possibly, supplying it. "I've been over this scan for 3 hours," Raleigh continued, his voice low. "There are new compartments. Hatches that weren't there yesterday. Your footage confirms it. Deck 12 was sealed when we mapped it. Now it's open." I felt my stomach twist. Compartments don't appear on derelict submarines. Hulls don't rearrange themselves. But I said nothing. I nodded, because I needed to hear the rest. Raleigh turned to me finally, his eyes tired. "We're sending you down again, and this time, you're taking one of ours with you." He gestured toward the door, where a man I hadn't seen before stepped in. He was younger than me, maybe early 30s, with a nervous energy that made him seem already guilty of something. His name tag read, Harris. No first name, just that. We suited up in silence. The dive was scheduled for 800. This time I carried a thermal scanner and a sensor probe tethered to the surface with real-time uplink. As we descended, I watched Harris out of the corner of my eye. He wasn't just nervous. He was terrified. Breathing too fast, hands shaking even inside the gloves. I asked him quietly, "First dive?" He shook his head. "No. First time going back." I didn't ask what he meant. Not then. The Mako loomed below us like a memory made steel. Still flawless, still intact. Her conning tower rose like a tombstone from the seabed, her nameplate unmarred by barnacles or corrosion. As we docked again at the upper hatch, something hit the side of the sub. Just once. A low thud. Then silence. We paused. Nothing followed. Harris looked at me and said, "That's how it starts." Inside, it was colder than yesterday. The lights flickered on again without being touched, but they were dimmer now, pulsing slowly, like a heartbeat. We moved through the upper decks, confirming our earlier path, everything still in place, maps on the walls, chairs pushed out at angles, beds still made in the crew quarters. But something felt off, not out of place, just wrong. Like the ship was wearing the same skin, but something inside it had changed overnight. When we reached the central corridor, we found the new hatch. It was welded shut yesterday. I was sure of it. The footage confirmed it. But now it was open. Just a crack. Enough for the light to spill through. We paused. Harris whispered, "They're letting us in." I asked who they were. He didn't answer. The lower deck was different. The floor sloped at an angle that didn't match the sub's structure. We walked downward, deeper than the blueprints should allow. The walls were lined with old equipment. Radios, sonar dishes, analog readouts, all still active. A low static buzz echoed from every speaker. Then, faintly through the distortion, a voice. Female. Garbled. Repeating. One phrase. "Proceed to central chamber. Welcome home." I froze. Harris backed up a step. "They know we're here," he whispered. We followed the signal. It led us to a sealed compartment marked Torpedo Room B, but there was no Room B on the manifest. The door opened when I touched it. No hiss, no resistance. Inside was not a torpedo bay. It was a hallway, one that curved. Submarines don't have curved corridors. Their designs don't allow it. But this one curved gently downward, as if guiding us somewhere. The further we went, the harder it became to breathe. The oxygen readouts were fine, but the air was thick, metallic, charged. The walls began to change too, from steel to something else. Blacker, almost organic, like scorched bone. I reached out to touch it. Warm, not from machinery, from blood. Harris grabbed my arm. "We shouldn't be here," he said, his voice shaking. "They warned us in '98. We didn't listen. We opened it anyway." I stopped. "You've been here before," I said. He nodded. "Not this deep, not this far, but close. And it was enough. Enough to know this sub isn't wreckage. It's a vessel, a prison, or maybe a mouth." We heard the sound again. The thud. Louder now. Closer. Repeating. A heartbeat in metal. The lights flickered out. In the darkness, something whispered through the air. Not in English, not in words. Just pressure. Intention. We turned back. We shouldn't have. The corridor was gone. Behind us. Only a wall, seamless, trapped. I pounded on the surface. It didn't echo like metal. It thudded like flesh. Harris dropped to his knees, sobbing. The whisper returned, louder now, clearer. "Stay, stay, stay." I activated the probe uplink. It went dead. No signal, no light. Just the hum of the submarine breathing around us. Then suddenly, the wall split open. No door. Just a crack, widening like a wound. And beyond it, a room. Circular. Walls lined with names etched in gold. Every name. Mine. Over and over again. Harris, too. Thousands of times. Different dates, future dates, death certificates. We ran. We didn't find the original corridor. We found another. One that led up, finally, to an old ladder. One I didn't remember. But we climbed it. And we surfaced. Back on the recovery ship, no one believed us. They said we were down only 17 minutes. Our logs read 4 hours. They said the thermal probe never transmitted. They said there's no hatch labeled Room B. They showed us photos. The hatch was gone. But the names, I remember. And that curve. That impossible curve. I've been on dozens of submarines. They don't curve. Something is reshaping that wreck. It's alive, and I think it's learning us. The second time I descended into the USS Mako, everything in me screamed that I shouldn't. There's a moment when you're strapped into a diving suit and they begin to seal the hatch above your head, where the air feels thinner, not just from compression, but from certainty. Certainty that you are voluntarily sealing yourself into something that is not made for the living anymore. We had opened the external hatch manually that morning. It was an effort that took nearly 3 hours, precise torque application, and more than one set of tools that shouldn't have worked in the first place. The locking mechanism was archaic, yet pristine. No corrosion, no damage. Like someone had oiled it from the inside just last week. But when the bolts released and the metal yawed open with an almost polite sigh, it revealed not the stagnant blackness we expected, but something far worse. Light. Faint, dim, flickering like the dying gasp of emergency bulbs. But it was light. That shouldn't have been possible. Not after 80 years on the seafloor. And yet, as I drifted in through the open hatch, every shadow seemed to stretch toward me like welcoming fingers. The corridor beyond was narrow, choked with the scent of old steel and something fainter, something coppery and stale. The kind of scent you only get in locked rooms that held breath and blood for too long. My gloved hand brushed the wall as I passed, and instead of flakes of rust or layers of silt, I felt warmth. Not heat from machinery. The residual heat of something that had been alive. The air was breathable. The moment we stepped through the pressure chamber and activated the internal air sensors, the readouts confirmed. 20.8% oxygen, normal CO2, no known toxins. I pulled off my mask slowly, expecting a jolt of nausea or the taste of mold. But there was nothing. Just stillness. Harris was the first to speak, his voice hushed as if afraid to wake something. It's like it waited for us. I didn't reply. I was too busy staring at the overhead lights. Dim strips embedded in the ceiling, humming softly. Powered. Active. Unwired. We moved deeper into the corridor. Every step echoed unnaturally, like the metal beneath us wasn't metal at all, but something hollow. I could hear my own breathing over the comms, my heartbeat thudding like war drums. The compartments on the left side were crew quarters, or what remained of them. Perfectly preserved bunks, blankets folded with military precision, boots placed neatly at the foot of each bed. One bed had a paperback novel open to a page mid-chapter. Another had a shaving kit laid out with a straight razor still wet. Wet. 80 years. The mess hall was next. It was like walking into a museum diorama. Set for inspection. Tables lined with metal trays of food, untouched. Canned peaches, white bread, beef hash, no mold, no insects. Just the smell. Faint, but fresh. I touched one of the trays, and my finger left a mark in the dustless surface of the food. It was soft. Still moist. Harris looked at me, and I knew we were both thinking the same thing. This place was either outside of time, or something inside it was still living. And eating. The captain's quarters were locked. I should have had to force them open. But when I reached for the wheel, the lock turned effortlessly, like it had been unlocked from the inside. The room was larger than expected, dominated by a heavy oak desk and leather chair, both pristine. A map of the Pacific Theater lay across the surface, with pins still stuck into positions long obsolete. Above the desk was a framed photo of a crew, 40 men in uniform, arranged in formal lines. My breath caught. At the back, second row from the top, stood a man who looked like me. Not resembled. Looked like. Same face. Same posture. Even the same expression I'd seen in the mirror that morning. Calm, but uncertain. I pulled the photo down. The back read, USS Mako, 1943, before departure. And below it, in faint pencil, they never came back. There was a radio in the corner. It crackled softly with faint static. Harris moved toward it and adjusted the dial. For a moment, nothing changed. Then a whisper. Just one word. Welcome. We froze. The signal vanished as quickly as it came. I reached for the desk drawer, unsure of what I expected, and pulled it open. Inside was a logbook. The cover was embossed with gold leaf, worn but intact. I opened it slowly. The first page listed the crew manifest. 52 names. I scanned the list until one stopped me cold. My name. First, middle, last, serial number, rank. It wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't close. It was exact. And below it, my signature. I turned to Harris. This isn't possible. But he wasn't looking at me. He was staring at the wall opposite the desk, where a calendar was pinned. The date read, July 11th, 1943. The red X marked that day. Today. We left the quarters in silence. The halls beyond seemed darker now, or maybe our perception had shifted. We entered engineering and saw gauges twitching. Fuel lines that should have been dry hissed softly with pressure. The generators thrummed beneath our feet. I turned to ask Harris if he heard it, but he was already staring at the bulkhead ahead. There were footsteps. Not ours. Wet, deliberate, heavy. They stopped just around the corner, beyond the engine bay. I raised my flashlight. The beam flickered, then steadied. Slowly, I moved toward the sound. Around the corner, nothing. Just another sealed hatch. But the footsteps, they had stopped too soon, as if waiting for us to follow. We turned back. There are things that don't make sense even when you see them. Things that break your understanding of time, decay, physics. But this place wasn't just preserved, it was aware. We weren't investigating the wreck of a lost war machine. We were stepping into something that had preserved itself by will alone. Or worse, been preserved by something else. Something that wasn't done with its crew. Or with us. As we began our ascent, Harris leaned in through the comms, his voice shaking. This wasn't a wreck. This was an invitation. And for the first time, I didn't think he was being paranoid. I thought he was right. We surfaced at dawn, the salt water drying into a chalky crust on our faces. But there was no warmth in the light that met us. Just a flat, gray haze that made everything seem suspended in a strange, reluctant morning. Back on the support vessel, I couldn't shake the cold. It wasn't the kind that creeps into your bones from the ocean's depths. It was internal, like something had moved inside and made itself at home. Harris didn't speak on the way up. He just stared at the deck, then at his own hands, as if unsure whether they were still his. The rest of the team debriefed as expected, talking over equipment readings, oxygen levels, hull pressure anomalies. But they avoided discussing the interior. It was as if saying it aloud might anchor it more firmly to reality. But I couldn't stop thinking about that manifest, about seeing my full name printed in that fading ledger, right where it didn't belong, or maybe where it always had. Later that afternoon, while the others were running diagnostics on the tools and reviewing sonar data, I returned to the records room. The USS Mako was supposed to be a ghost, but I needed to know who had once called it home. The Navy's digital archive had only redacted logs, lost at sea, presumed destroyed, 0 survivors. But I still had the photographs, the manifest, the signature that looked like it had been scrawled by my own hand. I pulled out a data slate and began transcribing the names from the physical logbook we'd retrieved. One by one they appeared on the screen, each accompanied by rank and assignment, petty officers, engineers, radio techs, even a ship's cook. 52 entries. But as I worked, a strange sensation gnawed at the back of my skull, a tightness like an impending migraine. The kind that comes not from pain, but from something you're trying not to remember. The name directly below mine made me stop cold. Samuel T. Harris. Not just a shared surname, same first and middle initials, same birth year. I blinked hard and checked again. No, it wasn't a match. It was exact. I cross-checked it with Harris's personnel file stored on board. There it was. Samuel Thomas Harris, born 1990, enlisted in 2009. The one in the manifest was listed as having enlisted in 1942. It didn't make sense, but the similarities didn't stop there. Of the 52 names, nearly half matched people I knew, personally or by reputation, divers, technicians, a couple officers I'd trained under. One had died in a training accident in 2018. Another went MIA in 2006. But their names, they were on that list. And always with some tiny variation in rank or spelling. Like a mirror that copied the image but added its own static. At first, I thought maybe it was some elaborate tribute, an officer's way of honoring future generations by planting echoes of them in the past. But then I noticed the annotations, tiny notes written in the margins of some pages in faint brown ink, so faded it was nearly invisible, unless the angle of the light was just right. Observed. Heard. Returned. One name had been crossed out entirely. The note beside it simply said, "Non-compliant. Sealed." That name was one I didn't recognize. But the final entry, it hadn't been there before. I was certain of it. The ink looked fresher, the line sharper. Below all the printed names, in a newly added scrawl, was mine again. This time with a timestamp. The exact minute I'd descended into the submarine earlier that morning. Next to it, another faint note. Acknowledged. Initial contact successful. I backed away from the terminal and rubbed my eyes. I told myself it was stress, misremembering, data corruption, anything that could explain it. But the facts remained. The manifest was changing. And it wasn't just recording history. It was predicting it. I returned to the logbook and ran a fingerprint scan across the page. Partial matches came up for 6 living personnel, current Navy staff. I double-checked. None of them had been involved in the Mako's discovery. None had even served in the Pacific. Yet somehow, their biosigns were present in a book last updated in 1943. I confronted Harris after dinner. He was staring off the edge of the deck, cigarette half-burned and forgotten between his fingers. I told him what I'd found. He didn't react, didn't blink, just nodded slowly and said, "I saw myself too." I waited, but he didn't elaborate. Just flicked the cigarette overboard and walked away. That night, I couldn't sleep. My quarters felt tighter than usual, the walls close and humming like they were thinking. I got up around 0200 and made my way down to the storage bay, where the logbook had been sealed inside a transport case. The bay was locked. The digital log said no one had entered since 1800. But the case was open. The logbook sat neatly on top, open to the final page. This time there were new entries below mine. Harris, Mallory, Chief Petty Officer Lee. All with timestamps matching the moment each one had first entered the Mako. Next to Harris's name was a new note. Progressing. Observation escalating. My name now had an addition beneath it too. One word, written in crisp, unbroken cursive. Awakened. I didn't remember writing it, but it was my handwriting. At No 3112, the ship's internal comm system buzzed to life, not with alarms or announcements, but with music. A faint, warbling tune that sounded like an old phonograph record. A 1940s swing number, upbeat and cheerful. It lasted exactly 47 seconds, then stopped. No one else acknowledged it the next morning. When I asked the comms officer about it, he looked confused. "Our systems don't have that channel," he said. "You probably picked up interference from the mainland." We were 300 miles from the nearest signal tower. The next dive was scheduled for the following day. But I knew we wouldn't be alone. We never had been. And now the Mako had our names, our signatures, our timestamps. It was keeping a record. For what purpose, I couldn't say. But it wasn't finished with us. Not yet. We went back under before sunrise. The ocean still clung to the night like a second skin, thick and indifferent to the rhythm of our breath as we sank in formation, drawn once again to the Mako's impossible stillness on the seafloor. I don't know if it was habit or something deeper, something already written in that cursed manifest, but I didn't fight the assignment. No one did. We moved as if compelled, not by orders or protocol, but by some unseen undertow that had gripped our lungs and wouldn't let go. The submarine loomed larger with each descent. It hadn't changed structurally, but its presence felt heavier, more intrusive, like it was aware of us now, like it had been waiting. The entry went smoother than before. The outer hatch gave less resistance, and even the interior pressure felt welcoming, as though the vessel had adjusted to our presence. We split into teams again. Mallory and Lee heading for the control room, Harris and I toward engineering. But before turning aft, I paused at the narrow passage leading to the torpedo room. It wasn't on our checklist. Officially, the door was still sealed, rusted shut from within, and marked as hazardous. But that never stopped the curiosity from festering in my chest. I moved closer, drawn by the same whisper of instinct that had made me reach for the logbook days earlier. The corridor to the torpedo room was narrower than I remembered. It shouldn't have been. Nothing in the ship's blueprint indicated a structural taper. But with each step, the overhead lights seemed to dim, the metal walls constricting. The air shifted too, growing warmer, denser, laced with a faint metallic tang like old blood left too long in still water. The door stood at the end, solid, circular, and bolted tight. Faded yellow stenciling above read, OR5, primary launch. But that wasn't what caught my eye. It was the smear of red, dry, flaking, but unmistakably organic, seeping from the bottom hinge like the ghost of a long-shed wound. I dropped to a knee and peered through the narrow seam beneath the door. Pitch black. No reflection from my helmet light. No echo when I tapped the metal. Just darkness, deep and absolute. And then, as I leaned in closer, I heard it. 3 soft knocks from the other side, precise, slow, as if timed to a rhythm older than language. I stood too quickly and almost lost balance, the weight of my oxygen tank suddenly wrong, pulling back, resisting my movement. I radioed Harris. "Torpedo room just knocked," I said, voice dry. He didn't respond right away. When he did, it was flat. It does that. Then silence. I wanted to push him, demand what he meant, but part of me already knew. We weren't the first to hear it. We were just the latest. Back at engineering, the systems looked almost pristine. Tubes still aligned, dials untouched by rust. But the temperature was off again. Too warm, too alive. Harris moved methodically, checking gauges, pretending this was just another day. But his eyes kept drifting back toward the aft corridor, toward the door that refused to open. I asked him when he'd first heard the knocking. He didn't answer. Instead, he pulled out a small field notebook from his pack and handed it to me. Inside were sketches of the door, drawn from memory, over and over. And beneath each one, the same timestamp, 03:43. That night, I set an alarm. Back on the support ship, sleep came in short, shallow bursts. The air in my quarters felt thin, as though something was pulling it from the vents before it reached my lungs. When 03:43 arrived, I was already awake, sitting at the edge of my bunk with the logbook in my lap. The pages fluttered, though the room was still. No wind, no draft. Just the pages moving of their own accord. They stopped at a blank sheet halfway through, where 3 fresh dots of ink appeared. Perfectly round, spaced like knuckles. A 4th mark began to form, but never finished. I slammed the book shut and left. At 0400, I descended alone. No orders. No permission. I needed to see what was on the other side of that door. The ship welcomed me. That's the only way to describe it. The lights turned on as I passed. The metal floor felt less like a corridor and more like a throat. Wet, warm, subtly shifting. I reached the torpedo room and placed my hand on the wheel. It was warm. Not from sun or friction, but warm like flesh. I turned it. Nothing moved. I tried again. Still nothing. But when I stepped back, something did move. A whisper against the door, low and breathless, like a sigh pushed through teeth too long sealed. Then, for a moment, I thought I saw something pressed against the metal from the inside. A shape. A hand. The faintest outline of a face. And then it was gone. I returned topside, silent. Mallory found me on the deck an hour later. He didn't ask anything. Just sat beside me and lit a cigarette. After a while, he said, "They sealed it after it took the first one. Back in 44. That's what the second crew was for." I didn't ask who it was. I already knew I didn't want the answer. Later that morning, Lee ran a pressure test on the sealed compartment. It showed slight increases, small enough to dismiss, unless you'd been watching the same pattern for 3 days. At exactly 03:43 each night, the internal pressure rose by 0.3 psi, as if something inside was pressing forward, as if it was waking. That evening, Harris packed his gear. "I'm not diving again," he told the team. No one tried to stop him. No one blamed him. He left without saying goodbye. I returned to the logbook. My name had changed. Not the letters, but the ink. Darker now, as if rewritten. As if someone was correcting it to make it fit better. The door remains sealed. But for how long, I don't know. What I do know is this. Whatever is in there is aware. It waits, it learns, and every night at 03:43 it knocks. And one day, someone will answer. Maybe I already have. The sea was calm that morning. Too calm, like it was holding its breath. Even from the deck of the support ship, I felt the weight of the ocean change, like something deep below had turned over in its sleep. I stood alone by the rail, wetsuit peeled halfway down, the salt from the last dive still clinging to my skin like a second memory. No one said it, but we were all delaying the next descent. The crew moved slower. The chatter was thin, mechanical. We were all thinking about the door. about the pressure readings, about the knocking that didn't stop when we surfaced. Because last night, it hadn't come from the Mako. It had come from the walls of the ship we were sleeping on. They put me on sonar that day, as if changing roles would distance me from the thing. But you can't distance yourself from something that remembers your name. The sonar chair creaked as I adjusted my headset, the analog screen glowing faint green with low-level pulses. At first, everything was normal. Ambient resonance, thermal current patterns, distant whale songs. Then, just as I leaned back to close my eyes, the signal changed. A sharp ping, then another, then 3 in sequence, spaced with precision, like footsteps in metal boots. I adjusted the gain, ran a filter, thinking it might be mechanical feedback or instrument error. But the pattern was too precise. Left, right, left. Pause. Right again. Mallory came in holding a coffee, but the moment he heard the playback, the mug froze in his hand. "That's inside," he said. "That's inside the Mako." We looked at each other without speaking. We had left the submarine sealed. No one had been inside it since the previous morning. No one was scheduled to enter it until the afternoon. I rewound the audio and listened again, this time isolating frequencies. The walking was joined by a soft, rhythmic sound, like whispering. But the whispering didn't follow human cadence. It repeated the same breathy syllables, layered over one another like overlapping film reels. I boosted the treble. And then, through the distorted cloud, I heard my own voice, faint, but unmistakable, whispering something I didn't remember saying. "We're still down here." I pulled the audio logs from earlier dives. The system had been recording passively, even when off duty. I found 5 separate instances in the last 48 hours where the same echo pattern appeared. Always around 03:43. Always followed by a voice. In one of them, it was Harris, the diver who had left us the day before, whispering the phrase, "He's almost through." I played that clip 3 times. I'd never heard Harris speak in that tone. I didn't think he even knew the system was recording. Mallory sat down beside me, his face hollow, pale. He pulled up a directory marked Mako Archive, Internal, that I hadn't seen before. Inside were unlisted audio files, all time-stamped between 1942 and 1944. The file names were all variations of internal sonar bursts, but when we played them, they weren't sonar. They were voice logs, conversations. Some of them sounded like training exercises, others like distress calls. But one file stood out. Its timestamp was August 12, 1943, the official date the USS Mako disappeared. We clicked it. The voice that spoke was mine. "I repeat," it said. "Compartment OR5 is compromised. The subject has reached Phase 3. Repeat. Subject has reached..." Then static. I don't remember recording it. I don't remember ever using the phrase Phase 3, but Mallory swore it was my voice. Even ran a match against our onboard biometric database. It came back 97.8% certainty. I should have felt afraid, but I didn't. Not yet. It was something colder than fear. A recognition. A feeling that time inside the Mako didn't move in one direction. That it wrapped and pulled and echoed back things you hadn't said. Yet. Later that day, we descended again. "Standard inspection," they said. Just routine. But they sent me alone. Said the others were prepping secondary systems, though I didn't see anyone near the suits. I dropped fast, cutting through the silence of the sea like a bullet in syrup. As I approached the Mako's hull, something shimmered across its surface. Not light, not shadow, but a ripple, like a breath passing through metal. I latched onto the side and activated the maintenance interface. The readout blinked. Status: Mission incomplete. Same as the transmission we'd picked up earlier that week. Inside, the temperature had dropped. The air was colder, thinner, as if the ship was trying to shrink from within. I moved toward the control room, but a sound pulled me to the corridor instead. A slow dragging, like something heavy pulled across the metal. I followed it to the central hub, just outside the torpedo room. No movement. But the air smelled sharp, like ozone and rust. I raised my flashlight and saw something smeared across the bulkhead. It wasn't blood. It was darker, thicker, like ink that had dried mid-word. And it formed letters. Not English. Not any language I recognized. But I understood it. I knew what it meant. Not the way you read a word. but the way you remember a nightmare. Back on the support ship, I checked the sonar again. The pings were still there, but they weren't echoes anymore. They were calls. Each one triggered another. Like something inside the Mako was reaching for something further down. Something deeper than even the trench below. On a hunch, I rerouted the sonar into a visual spectrogram, mapping the frequencies into a 3D topography. The waveforms twisted into shapes, not random, geometric, deliberate, like diagrams. Mallory said they looked like old naval schematics, but not for any vessel we'd seen. The center of the image showed a spiral, feeding in on itself. At its core was a mark, a circle bisected with 3 lines. I recognized it from the engineering deck. It was carved into the floor beneath the main generator, too precise to be rust. I went down with a flashlight and checked again. It was deeper now, as if whatever made it was still etching, still pressing outward from beneath the metal skin. That night, I dreamed I was underwater. Not diving, submerged. Inside the Mako, but without a suit. Breathing. Moving down the corridor. The torpedo door was open. Light pulsed from within, soft and blue like the glow from jellyfish. I stepped inside, and all the walls were mirrors. Every reflection showed me in a different uniform. In one, I wore a captain's coat from the 1940s. In another, a deep-sea suit from decades ahead. And in the last, I wore nothing but my own face. Old, weathered, and smiling. When I woke up, my headset was still recording. The audio picked up the same phrase whispered 5 times. You were always going to come back. The sonar logs from that morning showed a new anomaly. A signal rising from below the Mako. Not from the seafloor. Not from the trench. From somewhere deeper. A secondary ping had awakened. Its signature matched nothing in our database. Not submarine, not vessel, not wildlife. But it had rhythm. It was breathing. And it was getting closer. We returned to the Mako the next morning, just before first light. No one slept well the night before, not after the sonar incident, not after the dream that half the crew claimed to have had simultaneously. A corridor filled with mirrors, the faint outline of a man smiling back. We tried to dismiss it as shared stress, deep-sea claustrophobia, or the effects of oxygen-level discrepancies from the suit regulators. But the glances between us were tighter, the silences longer. No one said it aloud, but we all felt it. Something had crossed a threshold, and we were now on the wrong side of it. I led the dive this time, not because I volunteered, but because my name had been assigned by the system before anyone spoke. The dive roster updated itself. No one claimed responsibility. The tech team blamed a glitch. No one believed it. As I descended again toward the vessel resting like a fossilized thought at the bottom of the Pacific, I felt the familiar weight press against my chest. It wasn't pressure. It was familiarity, like coming home to a place you never lived but remembered vividly from a dream. I entered the Mako through the same hatch we always used, noting immediately the smell. Not rot, not sea, but food. Warm food. Something savory. Eggs, bacon, coffee. The smell shouldn't have existed. There was no power to the kitchen systems, and even if there were, the sealed compartments hadn't been entered in days. I made my way down the corridor toward the mess hall, each step louder than the last, though I didn't touch the ground with more force. The lights flickered slightly as I passed beneath them, following me like the slow blink of a cautious observer. When I opened the mess hall door, the air inside was warmer. Not stale. Warm. And everything had changed. The tables were arranged differently. The chairs pushed in neatly. Silverware placed precisely. Folded napkins with the Navy emblem embroidered in a style long outdated. On the far wall, where once there had been peeling paint and a blank rusted panel, now hung 3 framed photographs, black and white. Uniformed men, some smiling, some solemn, standing in tight formation. I stepped closer. My heart froze. In the second photo, standing at the back, partially obscured by a man in a peaked cap, was me. Same face. Same posture. Eyes looking straight into the lens. I leaned in, trying to dismiss it as coincidence, but there was no denying it. Not just similar. Identical. The uniform matched the era, 1943, and pinned to the breast pocket was a name tag. The letters were faint, but legible. It read, L.T.M. Stanton. I stepped back, heart hammering, and nearly tripped over a chair that hadn't been there a second ago. It scraped across the floor by itself, spinning slightly before settling perfectly in line with the table. I turned back to the photos. Now there were 4. The new one showed the same group, but the man in front was missing. Only I remained, centered now, as if promoted in the chain of memory. Mallory's voice crackled in my earpiece. "You seeing this too?" I hadn't realized he was behind me. He stepped in, eyes wide, camera in hand, scanning the room. "We were just in here 2 days ago. This wasn't here. None of this." He motioned to the photographs, the cutlery, the table layout. "This is a functioning mess. You feel the temperature?" I nodded. He pulled a thermometer from his belt and pointed it around the room. The ambient temperature was holding steady at 72 degrees Fahrenheit. But outside the room, the corridor was a frigid 45. The mess hall was insulated, not by engineering, by intent. I sat in one of the chairs, not sure why. It felt right. The moment I did, a low hum filled the room. Not mechanical. A note, like a choir humming a single tone through the walls. Mallory flinched. "That's not feedback," he said. That's resonance." He moved toward the galley window, where trays sat waiting. On one of them was a meal. Real food. Hot. Eggs, toast, black coffee. Steam curling from it as if it had just been prepared. He reached for it. "Don't," I said, voice sharp. He froze. I didn't know why I said it, only that every cell in my body screamed that something irreversible would happen if he touched that tray. He backed away. We stood there, watching the steam dissipate. And then the tray lifted. On its own. Hovered for a second. Then floated slowly across the room and vanished into the galley as the door shut itself with a hiss. We ran out, not from fear, not yet, but from instinct. We needed to check the footage. When we returned to the support ship and reviewed the helmet cams, the footage was there, but wrong. The mess hall was empty. Dusty. Decrepit. No photos. No food. No movement. But the audio still captured the hum, the resonance, and the thermal logs showed the sudden spike in temperature localized entirely within the mess hall walls. That night, no one went back down. Mallory and I stayed in the communications room, reviewing logs, listening again to the whispers from the sonar records. At exactly 03:43, the sound returned, not the knocking this time, but the scraping of chairs, tables, silverware. The mess hall was rearranging itself. Again, we routed a thermal camera to monitor the space remotely. At 04:01, movement was detected. The camera feed activated. The tables were arranged for what looked like a banquet. Dozens of trays. All filled. Candles lit. And the entire room occupied by still figures. Uniforms from the 1940s. No faces visible. All blurry, like smudged film. All except for one at the head of the table. Clear. Focused. Me. I stood watching the feed, staring back at myself as I lifted a glass and a toast, mouth moving, words unheard. But on the audio channel, we heard one thing. Not my voice, but the voice that had whispered from the sonar. It said, "We saved your seat." The feed cut. When we checked the camera, it had been melted from the inside. No external damage, no breach, just a twisted, scorched lens and wiring. I went back down the next day, alone. The mess hall was back to its original state. Dust, rust, decay. But on one table sat a folded napkin, embroidered with my initials, and a seat, pulled out, waiting. I didn't sit. Not yet. But I knew one day I would. Because it was already in the photo, and I was already raising the glass. I had stopped trusting the silence. That strange, brittle kind of quiet that draped over the Mako like old netting. Something that seemed to hold everything still, but was never entirely still itself. It breathed, almost, between the bulkheads and narrow passages, like lungs slowly filling with the dust of years that never passed. I told myself it was just the ocean pressing against the hull, the after-echo of depth and time squeezing the air thinner each day. But deep down, I knew. The submarine wasn't resting. It was listening. And it remembered me before I ever set foot inside. The incident with the mess hall had left the entire dive crew shaken. I had avoided questions from the officers above, reporting only what was recordable, verifiable, and mundane. Environmental instability, possible structural hallucinations, electroacoustic anomalies. Those were the words I used in the report. But they were lies. Carefully measured lies. What I didn't mention was the seat with my name on it, the photographs that changed, the man in the video feed who looked like me but older, or maybe younger, or maybe neither. The one who raised a toast to an audience of faces blurred by memory. I hadn't planned to return immediately, but something gnawed at the back of my skull, like a splinter lodged behind the eye, a sense of something incomplete, unread. I went alone, without authorization, under the pretense of running final scans on the central command room. I didn't tell Mallory. He was already on edge. He had started hearing things on the surface, faint signals and white noise, fragments of words that stopped just short of coherence. He wouldn't say it out loud, but I could see it in his eyes. He was beginning to wonder whether the Mako wasn't broadcasting, but summoning. I entered the submarine again during low tide, just after midnight. The current was mercifully calm. The descent, easy. The hatch opened without a sound this time, as if it had been waiting for me. As I moved through the corridor, the lights flickered again, but now they followed me 2 steps ahead instead of behind. The hum I'd heard before in the mess hall was now fainter, embedded in the metal itself, like it had fused with the memory of the ship. When I reached the command room, the air felt heavier, not suffocating, but charged, like the moment before lightning, like something about to be spoken aloud. The logbook sat on the navigation table, a heavy black leather-bound volume with the emblem of the U.S. Navy slightly faded on its cover. I'd seen it before, closed, sealed, inert. But now it lay open, pages splayed like wings, and ink moving. I froze. There was no pen, no stylus, no hand, yet the writing flowed as if dictated by thought alone. Not scrawled, but perfectly neat. The same naval script I'd seen in the captain's quarters. But this wasn't the captain's writing. It was mine. The entries described moments I hadn't yet lived. My descent that night. My breathing pattern. The way I paused outside the hatch, hesitant, then convinced. They described what I was wearing, the minor malfunction in my glove seal I hadn't even noticed yet. And then it went further. Lines I had never spoken. Thoughts I hadn't yet thought. He is here again, alone, just as before. The circle remains unbroken. I ran my hand across the page, but the ink was dry. Completely dry. The entry had just finished itself, and the ink had dried as if it had waited for me to read it since 1943. I flipped backward through the pages, each one more disturbing than the last. It documented the original crew. Not just their routines and orders, but their fears, their dreams, their confessions. One man wrote of hearing his dead wife whispering from the bulkhead. Another wrote of finding his own reflection sleeping in his bunk. A third claimed the submarine was buried in an ocean of memory, not water. "We are not sinking," one entry read. "We are being forgotten in slow motion." And that is worse. The final entry before the blank pages was a single line written in large, jagged letters, scratched in with something sharp. He returns to finish the writing. The next page turned itself. I swear to God. As if caught by a breeze that didn't exist, the paper flipped, exposing a fresh page. Then, like before, ink bled up from the grain. New lines forming. He sees the truth now. The vessel remembers his name. He is not the first. He is the last. And then, slowly, like it was savoring the moment, the penless script formed the words I had feared most. "Welcome back, Stanton." I stood up, heart pounding, and backed away. The lights in the room surged, then dimmed to a sickly amber. I could hear movement, not steps, breathing, the sound of someone exhaling from beneath the floorboards. I knew then I wasn't alone. Something else was with me, and it was reading over my shoulder. I ran from the command room, the logbook forgotten on the desk but its words still echoing in my head. I tried to radio the surface, no response. Only static, but not the usual kind. The signal had rhythm, a pattern. I recorded it on my wrist mic and analyzed it later. Morse code. Translated into English, it said, "The words are not yours, you are written." I surfaced without logging the trip. I said nothing to the others, but that night, I found the logbook again, on my bunk, dry, untouched by the sea, sitting on the Navy issue sheets like it had always belonged there. This time I didn't open it. I couldn't. But part of me knew it didn't matter. Whether I read the words or not, they were already inside me. The logbook had written them, and I had spoken them. Or maybe I always had. His name was Alvarez, senior diver, quiet type, but not the cold kind. He had a habit of checking his equipment 3 times before every dive, and he never joined in the card games or the dark humor that the rest of us clung to like a lifeline. He kept a small photo of his daughter tucked inside the inner flap of his suit, the laminate worn and creased from pressure and salt. He'd volunteered for the Mako dive assignments with the kind of stoic resolve that never really asks permission. Said it felt like he had to. Said something about the hull calling to him. I didn't press him on that. I should have. It was 3 days after the logbook incident, and the command above had begun requesting deeper scans of the internal chambers. We needed a new entry point into the torpedo room, which remained inaccessible, locked from the inside, with its outer hatch sealed shut, as if it had never been meant to open again. Alvarez volunteered for the exterior scan. Solo. I argued against it, but the mission lead overruled me. Said Alvarez knew the terrain, said he was stable, calm, professional, said we couldn't afford to delay. That was the word he used. Afford. Like time down there could be spent. Like we weren't already overdrawn. Alvarez descended at 0217. The tether and comms were solid. I was monitoring from the surface vessel, watching his body cam in grainy infrared as he passed the forward dorsal plating and traced the outline of the torpedo chamber. His breathing was calm, no tremors in the feed. He was humming. I didn't recognize the tune, but something about it made my skin crawl, like a lullaby you don't remember learning, but somehow know the words to. He paused near the starboard ballast, examined a hairline seam along the hull, and then stopped speaking altogether. The hum faded. Silence. I called for a response. Static. Then his camera flickered. Once. Twice. And then, not darkness, but something else. The feed returned. But it wasn't Alvarez's view. It was inside the Mako. The camera was still attached to him. That much was clear. But the walls were no longer external plating. They were corridors. Interior passageways. Somehow, impossibly, he was back inside. Yet the hatch had never opened. The readings still showed him outside. Pressure consistent. Tether unbroken. But the footage told another story. He moved with purpose. Walking now. Yes, walking. Through the narrow metal corridors, light flickering above. His voice returned, low and conversational. But he wasn't speaking to us. How long has it been? He asked. Silence. You remember me, don't you? A pause. I know. I didn't forget either. He turned into what looked like the mess hall, except it wasn't arranged like before. The long table was gone, replaced by 2 small round ones, chairs missing. A phonograph sat on a side bench, softly spinning a record that didn't play. Photos hung where they shouldn't, old and water-warped, but frozen in place. Faces blurred. And in the corner, sitting perfectly still, was someone. Not a corpse. Not a hallucination. Not quite human. The figure wore a uniform in the old Wubyu Navy style, pressed and flawless, but the skin beneath was gray and sunken, eyes milky, hands motionless on the table. Alvarez sat down across from it like he'd done it 1,000 times. They said you wouldn't wait, he said, voice steady. But I knew you would. I tried to cut the feed. No response. We sent 2 divers after him, Mallory and Singh. They descended fast, reached the last known coordinates, and found nothing. No Alvarez, no body, no gear. Just the tether, cleanly severed 3 inches above the clamp, like it had been cut with a scalpel. But the feed kept transmitting. Alvarez looked at the figure and smiled faintly. They don't remember, he whispered. But I do. I remember the games we played, the sounds, the codes. You told me the stories when I was little. You were always down here, weren't you? The figure didn't move, but the camera glitched again. Horizontal lines tearing across the image like magnetic distortion. Then the figure tilted its head slightly, not toward Alvarez, but toward the lens. Its eyes rolled up, white and hollow, and its mouth twitched into something like a grin. Not wide, not dramatic, just enough to let you know it saw you. Saw me. Saw everything. I froze. Everyone in the control room did. Then Alvarez turned to look into the lens, and for the first time it felt like he saw us. Really saw us. His pupils dilated, and his expression shifted from serenity to confusion. Why did you follow me? He asked, as if shocked. You're not supposed to be here yet. He stood abruptly, and the figure across from him dissolved into fog, dissipating in place like smoke pulled through a vent. The walls began to blur. Light bled through cracks that weren't there before. And then the signal died. That was the last we saw of him. We recovered his camera 3 hours later. It was lying in the mess hall. Our mess hall. On the Mako. Resting neatly on the center of the table, still dry despite the moisture in the air. And underneath it, a note. A piece of paper we didn't put there, yellowed and stained with time. In thick, typed letters, it read, "Transfer complete. Crew member number 37, returned." We never found his body. The Navy closed the investigation within the week. Official cause: equipment failure, diver lost at depth. We held a memorial, played the anthem, folded the flag, said the words. But none of us believed them. Sometimes, late at night, when the sub is quiet and the radio goes dead, I can hear him again, humming that song. Not over the speakers, not in the water, inside the walls, inside the steel. He's still on board, and he's not alone. There's something about the hum of an engine room that gets into your bones after long enough at sea. You don't notice it right away. Not as a sound, exactly, but as a rhythm. A cadence behind the cadence. A second pulse beneath your own. Most modern vessels have engines that roar or vibrate in predictable ways. The kind of mechanical predictability that brings comfort to those of us who live by numbers and pressure gauges. But the USS Mako's engine room didn't hum. It didn't vibrate or clank. It throbbed. A slow, deliberate pulsation that felt wrong even before I realized I could feel it through the soles of my boots when standing above it. The first time I noticed it, I thought it was my heartbeat reacting to adrenaline, or maybe the side effect of pressure fluctuation. But it wasn't mine, and it never matched the rhythm of any living thing on our crew. After Alvarez disappeared, everything shifted. The Navy sent new protocols, more rigid and less rational. We weren't to enter the torpedo room under any circumstances, even if we managed to force the door. We weren't to disturb the mess hall or attempt to remove the photographs that now lined the corridor outside of it. But more disturbingly, we were ordered not to touch the engine, not to run diagnostics, and under no condition were we to power down its core systems, which made no sense. The Mako was supposed to be a derelict, a husk, a tomb. But the deeper we ventured into her systems, the more alive she seemed, and the more that pulsing behind the walls seemed to synchronize with our presence. We assigned shifts to monitor the engine room, mostly to ensure that nothing spontaneous occurred. But I knew we were all hoping to catch something definitive. Proof. Validation. Maybe even closure. On my shift, I would sit near the main control console, just beyond the reinforced catwalk overlooking the triple-cylinder power station. It should have been dormant. After all these years underwater, it should have been corroded through. But instead, it gleamed, clean, glistening in places like it was oiled recently. I'd run my hand over a lever that shouldn't have moved and felt it twitch back like a reflex. No power source, no fuel cells, just motion. Organic, deliberate motion. And then one night we heard the first breath. That's the only word that fits. It wasn't air escaping a pipe or steam shifting in a line. It was an inhalation. Deep, slow, measured, and then another. Not rapid, not panicked. Just breathing. Like the vessel itself had lungs. It came from below the main chamber, near the reactor vents, except there wasn't supposed to be any open cavity down there. The schematics showed a sealed shaft, no access. But when we inspected it, the metal plates were hot to the touch, and condensation formed in visible patterns, like a human chest exhaling against a mirror. Miller, one of the junior engineers, got the worst of it. He insisted he could hear whispers when he leaned close to the generator intake. Said they were childlike, repetitive. We thought he was cracking under stress. But then we saw the marks. He showed up in the galley with red imprints across the front of his shirt. 5 distinct fingerprints, each the size of a child's hand, and pressed so hard they left bruises beneath the fabric. He swore he hadn't touched anything, hadn't even fallen asleep. But the bruises matched handprints left on the control console earlier that day. Small, wet, precise. Like someone, or something, had been playing with the switches when no one was looking. The breathing intensified over the next few days. It became part of the rhythm, a background pattern we couldn't ignore. It started to sync with the lights. Every time the vessel inhaled, the overhead fluorescence dimmed slightly, just for a second. When it exhaled, they'd return to full brightness. We checked the voltage and found no anomaly. We checked the backup generators, still offline. The readings lied, but the lights never did. On day 10, the engine turned itself on. There was no sound of ignition. No spark or whine. Just a low rumble that bloomed outward like the groan of a waking animal. The internal temperature rose by 3 degrees in less than a minute. Gauges we hadn't touched began ticking, dials turning, and gears shifting behind walls we never opened. And then the ventilation system, long thought corroded shut, came to life, pushing warm air through the ducts like breath from lungs. One of our medics described the smell as sterile decay. I don't know what that meant. I still don't. We tried to shut it down, but every command was met with a reset. When we cut the connection to the bridge, the engine simply rerouted itself. When we physically unplugged the control arrays, they reattached themselves. One of the men swore he saw the cables moving on their own, like tendrils seeking connection. I didn't believe him, until I watched one slither an inch toward its port before stopping, as if it sensed I was watching. After that, the hallucinations began. They were subtle at first. Shadows in corners that shouldn't hold depth, reflections in the brass that lingered a moment too long, and the soft sound of boots pacing on the catwalk above the reactor even when the crew was locked down for rest. But then came the voices, whispered names, sometimes our own, sometimes names from the logbook, which none of us had spoken aloud. I began hearing Alvarez calling out over the intercom, even though we disabled it after he vanished. He would say simple things. Turn it off. Don't let it surface. And once, chillingly, it remembers you. We documented everything. Videos, logs, audio. But by morning, they were always blank. Every file corrupted. Every drive erased. And always replaced with one single folder, renamed over and over again as breath. We sent a final report to command. They didn't reply. Instead, we received new orders. Do not touch the reactor again. Do not enter the engine room. Do not question the rhythm. Maintain observation only. As if they knew. As if they'd known all along. I still sit in that room sometimes, listening. Not because I'm brave, but because I'm terrified of what happens if no one does. The Mako isn't just a relic. It isn't just haunted. It's alive. And now that it's breathing again, it's learning. Learning our names. Learning our routines. Learning how to move. It started with a flicker. Just static at first. A flicker in the corner of the comm station, where the old analog transmitter we'd brought aboard to monitor backup frequencies started pulsing with low-level hiss. We assumed it was interference from the pressure gradient, or maybe residue frequencies bouncing around the hull from our equipment. It was harmless, we thought. Nothing but white noise. Until the static turned into rhythm. Not a broadcast. A beat. Something intentional. Like a metronome made of breath and crackling dust. I sat alone on shift that night, the others asleep above in the habitat pod, and I remember leaning close to the receiver just as a voice whispered through the hiss, "Don't leave us down here." I froze. My first thought was that it was a prank. One of the techs rerouting signal through a voice modulator, maybe trying to mess with me. But I recognized the voice. And not in the usual way you recognize someone you've met. It was my own. My exact voice, same inflection, same rasp in the vowels, same hesitation at the end. Except I hadn't spoken. I hadn't touched the mic. I hadn't said a thing. I stared at the waveform on the screen, hoping for a glitch, a mechanical loop, anything to rationalize what I'd heard. But the wave was clean. Sharp. No distortion. Not mechanical. It had depth. Intent. It wasn't just mimicking me. It was responding to thoughts I hadn't spoken aloud. I tested it. I whispered a phrase in my mind, a line from a poem my father used to recite when I was young. And then it came back through the speaker. That same line whispered back, word for word, in his voice. His real voice, down to the stutter he had when he was dying. Beneath the waves, we wait in grace. It should have been impossible. It wasn't a recording. It wasn't memory. It was something else. The others heard it too. Over the next few days, the static increased. It grew louder whenever we passed the corridor near the engine room and peaked at 0343 every morning. Always at the same pitch, as though something deep in the Mako was synchronizing with us, tuning us to its signal. Miller went first. He said he kept hearing his sister's voice in the static. She died in a car crash a year ago. He'd found a copy of her last voicemail transcribed in the margin of his logbook, in her handwriting. None of us believed him until we saw it with our own eyes. The ink hadn't bled, hadn't smudged. It was recent, as if she'd written it that morning. Then Reyes heard his childhood friend's laugh echo down the corridor. A man who had drowned in a training exercise 12 years earlier. We found Reyes staring at the comm panel later that day, unblinking, as the voice of his old friend repeated the same sentence over and over. It's not the bottom we fear. It's the memory. When I tried to pull him away, Reyes turned to me and whispered, "They're still here. They're still down here. And they remember everything." We started recording the transmissions, documenting each voice, trying to trace origins. But each time, the files were corrupted within hours. One of the techs, Harris, caught a glimpse of the deletion process while reviewing footage. The cursor didn't move like a hand was guiding it. It flickered, skipping frames, as if something was rewriting the data between moments. Something that understood our systems better than we did. When we tried to isolate the transmitter and disconnect it from the Mako's internal systems, it refused to power down. In fact, the act of unplugging the module only made the signal clearer. The voices grew louder, more insistent. They began to name us. First names, then middle names, then serial numbers. Secrets only we would know. One of the men broke down when the static called him by a nickname his mother used. One she had whispered only once, in the hospital before she died. No one else knew it. The voice didn't just speak it. It mourned it. Like it missed her too. Then the real horror came. One night, we heard the full transmission. A clear voice, male, confident. It identified itself as Lieutenant Commander James Red Collins, commanding officer of the USS Mako, declared missing in action July 17, 1943. The voice detailed a mission trajectory that matched our current coordinates. Not from the past, but from the present. The voice insisted they were alive, trapped, and fused into metal. That the Mako had become a host, a brain with no body, and that they were its memory. He said the submarine needed new minds to update its identity, and we were chosen. When someone asked who had chosen us, the voice paused, and then a chorus answered through the static. You did. The next day we found a new line in the digital log, one that none of us had written. It said, transmission synchronized, language recalibrated, phase 2, integration. We searched every system, every protocol. Nothing registered the update. It was as though the submarine had accepted us not as guests, not even as intruders, but as parts, fragments to be added to a larger consciousness. And then came the mirror voices. On the 8th night, we heard ourselves. Not our voices imitated, our actual voices. Private conversations, doubts we'd whispered in isolation, lines we'd rehearsed in our heads but never spoke aloud. They played back through the static, not in mocking tones, but in precise mimicry, like the Mako was rehearsing us, getting better at pretending to be us. One by one, it stitched our identities together in the noise. That's when we realized it didn't want us to leave. Not just physically, it wanted to keep pieces of us. Our memories, our fears, our regrets. It wanted everything unspoken, every unshed tear, every broken promise, every death we'd buried, and every name we refused to speak. And it stored them like songs, playing them back through the wires, through the vents, through the pipes behind our heads at night. When I finally got the courage to pull the main comms breaker, the entire vessel groaned. Not mechanically. It felt like pain. A low moan in the metal that trembled through the walls. I didn't know metal could mourn. I didn't know it could scream. But the Mako did. And in that scream, I heard every name from the crew manifest of 1943 shouted backward in sequence, ending with mine. Now, when I sit by the radio, it's silent for hours. But eventually, always, it comes back. A whisper, a breath, a question I never asked out loud but think too loudly in the dark. Am I still me? The answer never changes. It comes in my own voice, through the hiss, not anymore. It happened during the one night we didn't assign anyone to monitor the hatch directly. Not because we were careless, but because we had grown exhausted, hollowed out by fear, grief, and confusion that seemed to breathe through the bulkheads. We had been rotating watch schedules for days, sometimes doubling shifts just to ensure no one was ever alone for more than a few minutes. But exhaustion has a way of unthreading discipline. I had dozed off in the equipment bay, face buried in a logbook I hadn't been able to finish for 3 days, when a low metallic groan rolled through the submarine like the sound of bones being ground beneath a great weight. It didn't startle me. That was the terrifying part. It felt expected, as though I'd been waiting for that very moment since we first stepped onto the Mako. The sound was different this time. Longer, slower, deliberate. I followed the source like a man in a trance, flashlight beam cutting through dust and condensation, past the dormant torpedo tubes and up the ladder well, to the central hatch that connected to the pressurized entry chamber. It was open. Not just unsealed, not just ajar. Open. The metal crank that required 2 men to turn when we first entered the vessel now hung limp, as if it had spun freely on its own. I called out for Reyes, for Miller, for Harris. None answered. The chamber was empty. No sign of forced entry. No breach. No pressure loss. Just the hatch, gaping open like the jaw of some enormous steel beast that had finished speaking and now waited for a reply. I approached cautiously, light trembling slightly in my hand, and stepped through into the chamber. That's when I noticed the vapor. It was subtle at first, like breath on a window pane, swirling in slow, deliberate spirals across the floor. The vapor didn't rise. It slithered, hugging the metal, flowing with purpose. When I knelt to inspect it, my flashlight flickered twice and died completely. No warning. No power failure anywhere else. Just the beam. Gone. I stood in total darkness for maybe 3 seconds before the backup emergency glow kicked in, bathing the chamber in soft red light. That's when I saw it. The vapor wasn't vapor at all. It moved too intentionally, like tendrils. Not smoke, not steam. Shape. It formed for barely 2 seconds. A humanoid silhouette standing in the hatch's frame, facing outward. Arms at its side. Head slightly bowed. Its body lacked detail, but its outline was painfully human. Not ghostly. Not translucent. A column of shifting condensation with a shape that could mimic posture and presence. It turned slowly, as though sensing my breath, and then it collapsed, vanishing into the floor like it had been inhaled by the submarine itself. I don't remember falling, but I must have, because I woke up on the deck floor with Reyes and Harris kneeling beside me, their voices muffled and panicked. My skin was ice cold, my pupils unresponsive. The hatch was shut again, locked. No one had touched it. The camera above the door, which we had installed on day 1 for procedural safety, was still operational. We reviewed the footage immediately. It showed nothing for the first 30 minutes, just empty stillness, condensation forming in beads. Then, at 03:43, the hatch lock spun without contact. The wheel rotated against its own resistance. The seal disengaged. No hands, no tools, just motion. And then the vapor emerged. On camera. The footage showed it pouring out like smoke under pressure, but reversing gravity. It didn't billow. It poured upward, hugging the walls, caressing the ceiling, condensing into a form just like I had seen. It lingered in the doorway. Then it took a step forward. The most chilling part wasn't the shape. It was the shadow it cast. The emergency lights behind it should have projected a blurred silhouette. Instead, the figure cast a defined shadow on the opposite wall, one wearing a naval officer's uniform, complete with a W-era rank insignia and cap. I paused the footage at that moment. The insignia was identical to that of Commander Collins, the Mako's last known commanding officer. But the face was mine. We played the footage again and again. The silhouette never changed. No glitches, no visual artifacts. Just that one moment, burned into tape, frozen in red hue. Harris suggested it was a projection, a reflection from the periscope lens catching our own shadows. Reyes said nothing. He just stared at me for too long, his eyes darting to the name stitched above my chest. The camera feed continued. The vapor collapsed. The hatch resealed. The wheel turned back into place. Not quickly, not automatically, but slowly, as if performed by careful hands. And when it was sealed, the emergency light outside flickered off and never came back on. The feed cut out 2 minutes later. No one had touched the camera system. After that night, we stopped sleeping entirely. We took shifts monitoring the hatch, the bridge, the engine room, the torpedo chamber. But something in the Mako had changed. It no longer hid. It no longer whispered. It began to show us its shape, its intention. Objects moved during the day now. Lockers opened and closed with the sound of sighs. The crew quarters, which we had previously sealed off for our own peace of mind, began to emit sounds of movement. Clothes rustling, beds creaking, boots stepping in unison. And every night at precisely 03:43, the temperature in the ship dropped by 9 degrees. Exactly 9. Never more. Never less. The same number of recorded crew members lost aboard the Mako, according to the altered manifest. We began to suspect the Mako wasn't haunted by its crew. It was the crew, or what remained of them. Memories given shape, commands given breath. The hatch, now locked from the inside again, no longer responded to our tools. We tried welding it shut, but the next morning the welds were undone, cleanly peeled like banana skin. We tried posting 2 men to guard it. One of them, Miller, began talking in German in his sleep. He never learned the language. His grandfather had fought in Europe, but Miller was born in Ohio. When he awoke, he didn't remember speaking at all. But we recorded it. He said, in a clipped naval dialect, "We're already aboard. Let them in. I haven't left the submarine since. Not truly. My body returns to the ship on the surface, but my mind lingers below. I hear the hatch opening in my dreams. I feel the pressure change in my ears when I sleep too close to a wall. And sometimes, when I breathe, the air smells like the Mako, like salt, oil, and something much older. A smell that doesn't belong to this century. The hatch wants to open again. I can feel it. The ship is remembering, and every memory it claims becomes easier to keep. The more we resist, the more we forget what it means to be outside of this place. I don't know who unlocked the hatch. I don't know if it was ever locked at all, but I do know this. When it opens again, someone, maybe all of us, will walk through it. Not to escape, but to stay. The periscope wasn't supposed to function. That's what our brief had said anyway. Non-operational. Fused optics. Waterlogged relay seals. The technical terms layered over one another like excuses made not to explain but to quiet curiosity. From the first day aboard the Mako, we had walked past the periscope well without giving it more than a glance. The thick tube stood dormant, its polished brass dulled, lenses opaque with age. Until the morning Reyes asked why the compass around it had begun ticking. A subtle mechanical twitch, every few seconds, like something internal was trying to align itself. He called me over, hesitant, and I watched it for a full minute before the ticking stopped. That would have been the end of it. Just another oddity among the hundreds already catalogued. Until the mirror inside the eyepiece reflected movement. Not ours. Something deep, impossible, deliberate. I leaned in slowly. The moment my eye met the glass, something shifted behind it. So subtly I almost dismissed it as an optical illusion. A flicker, a shimmer, a ghost of motion. I adjusted the focus ring by habit. The gears responded with fluid, oiled ease that defied 8 decades underwater. No resistance, no rust. And then I saw it. Not the ocean, not the seafloor, but a room. A medical ward. More precisely, a Wu-era naval infirmary lit by hanging fluorescents, flickering slightly, as though captured on worn VHS tape. Rows of cots lined the bulkhead, each occupied by a soldier in faded hospital fatigues. Some sat upright, others lay perfectly still. All of them had white bandages over their eyes, and yet all of their faces were angled toward me, unmoving, watching, not blinking, not breathing. My own breath caught. The lens shouldn't have shown this. We weren't connected to any feed. The periscope's external optics pointed into the black silt of the trench we hovered over. But the scene before me remained steady, clear, disturbingly detailed. I turned the scope slightly. The view panned smoothly as if sliding through a space that shouldn't exist, and settled on one figure near the end of the room. This one was different. He wasn't bandaged. He lay on his side, eyes closed, body curled slightly inward like someone resting uneasily. His uniform was newer, modern navy blues, not vintage olive drab. I noted the patch on his sleeve. It matched mine. My last name, my rank. Even the stitch error near the shoulder seam that I'd always meant to repair. I told myself it was coincidence. I told myself I was hallucinating, the product of oxygen deprivation or stress. But then the man on the bed twitched. His hand jerked upward. His eyes opened. eyes that weren't bandaged at all, eyes that mirrored mine. I stumbled back from the periscope like it had burned me. I didn't say anything to Reyes. I couldn't. I didn't have words for it yet. Not even fear. Just a hollow echo where comprehension should have been. That night, the periscope rotated on its own. We heard it. At 03:43, of course. Always that time. The groan of its internal gears echoed through the control room, steady and rhythmic. When we rushed in, the lens was fogged with condensation from the inside, as if someone had breathed on it. Miller wiped it clean, but nothing showed through the eyepiece. Blank darkness again. The infirmary gone. We decided to remove the scope, disconnect it, shut down its mechanism. But when Reyes opened the access panel, he found nothing but polished copper interior. No wires, no mirrors. Just a hollow pipe that ended 3 feet below the surface, as if the periscope had never been functional to begin with. Still, it worked. That next evening, I returned alone. Compulsion, maybe. Curiosity sharpened by dread. I knew I shouldn't. I knew the ship was bleeding something into our perception, manipulating us one by one. But I needed to see if the man was still there. I looked again. The room returned. The ward hadn't changed, except this time, the soldiers had risen. They stood beside their beds, backs rigid, facing forward like mannequins. The lighting was dimmer now. The flickering overhead bulbs cast long shadows across the floor. I counted them. 9. Always 9. The same number of crew members listed as MIA in the falsified manifest. The ones that never made it off the Mako. The man in my uniform still lay on the bed, but now his eyes were open, and he was mouthing something. I couldn't hear it. The periscope didn't transmit sound, but I read his lips, slowly, over and over. You are already me. A chill crawled down my spine as I backed away again. This wasn't just a vision. It was a message, a warning, or maybe a preparation. That night I dreamt of being in that infirmary, not as a visitor, as a patient. I felt the cold sheets under my hands, smelled the antiseptic in the air. I saw shadows gather around my cot, and when I turned my head, the men beside me were no longer bandaged. They had my face. All of them. Identical. Copy after copy of my own features, etched with different wounds, different scars, but all unmistakably me. One leaned in and whispered, he needed a face. I woke up gasping for breath, blood crusted beneath my nose, my ears ringing with static. Reyes found me kneeling in the corner of the command room, mumbling fragments in Morse code I didn't recall learning. The ship had become a mirror, reflecting not just images, but intentions. Echoes of who we were, or who we were becoming. I asked Miller to destroy the periscope. He tried. Sledgehammer to the lens. It didn't even crack. Not a scratch. Instead, the metal handle spun twice and came to rest on its own, pointed toward me. That's when Miller snapped. Said the ship didn't want us to leave, that it wanted a crew again. That's why it was mimicking us, testing who would fit. We restrained him, but I knew deep down he wasn't wrong. The Mako wasn't just preserving memory. It was recruiting, replacing. Every interaction was a rehearsal, every reflection a casting call. And I was center stage. Since then, I've avoided the periscope, but it still turns at night. Slowly, like it's looking for someone, or something. Sometimes I catch my reflection in the polished brass casing, but the man staring back no longer blinks when I do. His eyes are too steady, his smile too fixed. I think he's waiting for me to come closer. One last look, one last step, and the replacement will be complete. I didn't notice the blinking light on the control console until it had already been active for several minutes. It was subtle, low frequency, buried beneath a cluster of dormant switches no longer connected to any working system. Or so we thought. The monitor it was wired to hadn't powered on once since we arrived. Dead screen, broken fuse, confirmed during our diagnostics. So when the console flickered back to life in complete silence, it felt less like a system restart and more like an ancient heart remembering how to beat. Reyes was the one who leaned in first, squinting at the monochrome display as green letters stuttered across it, one after the other, in a cadence that matched military protocol we hadn't used since the Cold War. At first, it looked like a diagnostic check, or maybe a corruption of stored data. But then the command string began to repeat itself. RMD, RDY, FWD tubes, TRGT lock, execute ORDR. And then, again. ARM-D, RDY, FWD tubes, TRGT lock, execute ORDR. Always in that order. No variation, no timestamp. The system wasn't asking for input, it was confirming it. Reyes asked who sent the transmission. Miller and I exchanged a glance because we both knew the answer before we even looked. The source ID tag was still embedded at the bottom of the screen. USS Mako 093, the ghost ship itself. The dead vessel we were standing inside was issuing launch orders. We hadn't even powered the torpedo systems. We hadn't even found the access point to the fire control bay. But the display pulsed like a heartbeat, insisting the payloads were armed, the tubes were loaded, the target was locked, and we were one confirmation away from execution. The phrase "target locked" shouldn't have been possible. There were no sonar pings, no trajectory data, no external periscopic link feeding coordinates into the targeting suite. But the system knew where it was pointing. It had chosen something. We tried to pull the connection logs. Every packet of data was dated July 7th, 1943, the date the Mako was reported missing. But the transmission had a timestamp for this morning, 0433 hours. When we checked the server's system clock, it had split into two time signatures. One read 2025, the other insisted it was 1943, and the logs from both timelines were identical. Parallel entries, dual confirmations, two worlds bleeding into each other. The submarine wasn't echoing anymore. It was broadcasting. Reyes suggested it was malware, an old cyber warfare payload designed to mimic command sequences in case the vessel was ever recovered by enemies. It made sense, for about 10 seconds, until the commands shifted. New lines began to type themselves onto the console, one by one. Slow, deliberate. Crew complete. Condition active. Mission never cancelled. Awaiting redeployment. We stood in silence, unsure if we were watching a computer speak or a presence using code as language. When Miller tried to pull the plug, the breaker panel exploded in a shower of sparks. He wasn't hurt, just dazed. But when we pulled his sleeve back, there was a number burned into his forearm. 093. The hull number of the Mako, burned into the skin as if by branding iron. That's when we stopped pretending this was just circuitry. The Mako wasn't reactivating. It was waking up. The rest of the ship responded accordingly. Panels began to hum. Vents hissed warm air as if climate control systems had reinitialized. The red combat lights above our heads flickered on and stayed solid. The deck beneath us thudded once, deep and low, like something shifting in its sleep. Every screen we had previously dismissed as dead now displayed internal schematics. On one of them, we watched in real time as the torpedo tubes glowed a faint amber, indicating power status, and then they turned green. We descended to the torpedo room, finally, using the emergency bypass to open the rust-sealed door we had been avoiding since day 3. The air inside was warm. It shouldn't have been. The batteries had been dead for decades. But there it was, residual heat, like from a living organism. The torpedoes themselves weren't rusted hunks of forgotten metal. They were pristine, gleaming, engraved with serial numbers that matched no known Navy registry. One of them bore a phrase stenciled in English: "Retribution, not retirement." The meaning of that phrase haunted me more than anything else we'd seen. It wasn't just threatening. It was personal, vengeful. As if the submarine itself had been denied something, and now, after 80 years in the dark, was taking matters into its own hands. Reyes began pacing, whispering that this wasn't an accident, that this was a Cold War relic they never told anyone about. Some kind of rogue AI, maybe, or a secret weapons program designed to live beyond its time. But I wasn't convinced. Because as the ship began transmitting again, the language wasn't just commands. It was names. Ours. One by one, we watched our full identities appear on the central screen. Rank, ID, blood type, service record, clearance level. And then, next to each name, fit for duty. Even Jennings, who'd gone missing 2 days earlier and was presumed dead. His name glowed green. We tried to shut the system down, full power kill. It didn't work. Instead, the Mako issued another command. This time, in plain English: "Final authorization required, Captain, redacted." Only one problem. The name was mine. The system was asking for my biometric confirmation to proceed with launch. A launch of what, exactly, I couldn't say. but everything inside me screamed that if I placed my hand on that panel, we'd never be able to stop it again. I refused. The screen dimmed. Then a countdown appeared. 24 and red numbers, just sitting there, ticking down 1 second at a time. No further input required. The Mako had waited long enough for orders. Now it would finish what it started. That night, I lay awake in the auxiliary berth, listening to the pipes vibrate with pulses that no longer felt mechanical. A heartbeat in steel, a mind in rust. I dreamt of launch tubes opening not into the ocean, but into cities. I saw sirens that hadn't sounded in decades blaring once more. I saw shadows rising from the torpedo bay in the shape of sailors long dead, eyes burning with salt and memory. When I woke, the countdown read 21:17:43, and for the first time, I began to wonder if this was never about discovery. Maybe the Navy didn't want us to fix the Mako. Maybe they wanted us to trigger it. At first, we thought the change in pressure was a system anomaly, a quirk of depth currents, or a minor misreading of internal gauges long degraded by salt and time. But the numbers didn't lie. The ballast indicators were climbing, slowly, relentlessly, like a slow exhale building in the lungs of something that had held its breath for far too long. The USS Mako was rising, without command, without propulsion, without consent. It was ascending. At first the rise was minimal, 0.5 meters per hour, something easily dismissed as ocean drift or displacement adjustments caused by our presence. But by day 2 we were nearly 10 meters closer to the surface, and no one was laughing anymore. We attempted to equalize the trim tanks manually, injecting seawater to weigh her down. The pumps engaged, lights blinked, valves hissed, but the depth continued to tick upward. We increased the ballast override to maximum capacity. Nothing changed. It was as if the Mako had made a decision of its own, a decision no crew, no command, no physical counterweight could defy. Reyes ran diagnostics on the control systems. Miller attempted to purge the compressed air lines. I went into the keel chamber myself, diving through narrow maintenance corridors to reach the failsafe vents. Everything was where it should be, but none of it responded. The mechanisms were moving, but the logic wasn't ours. The pressure sensors began to glitch. One moment stable, the next spiking. And then, sometime after midnight, the hull groaned. Not in protest, in purpose, in hunger. The dreams came next. We'd all been having them, silently, ashamed to admit that they were identical. We dreamt of surfaces, not ocean surfaces, but memories. Childhood streets, empty of life, wet with unseen rain. We dreamt of waiting rooms where clocks had no hands, where announcements played in voices we recognized as our own. We dreamt of surfacing into cities buried under oceans, where windows blinked and skyscrapers whispered in sonar. The dreams weren't ours. They were the Mako's, or perhaps what now lived within it. I found Reyes standing in the mess at 0400 hours, staring at the window that didn't exist. The outer hull had no portholes, but there it was, a circle of glass fogged with salt, light filtering through. Beyond it, stars, too many. Not the constellations of the Pacific sky, but some alien firmament in which no stars moved and no darkness rested between them. She said nothing, just pointed. I reached out to touch it. My hand passed through metal. No glass, no light, just steel. But the chill remained on my palm. By the end of the 3rd day, we were 30 meters shallower. The surface was within reach, but so was something else. Static had returned to the comms. Not the usual background noise of sonar interference, but language. Garbled, clipped, reversed. Reyes recorded it, filtered it, ran audio inversions. A phrase emerged. I remember the air. We played it again, slower. I remember the air. Again. I want it again. The voice was not one of ours. But it used our cadence. It borrowed our breath. We debated evacuation. Protocol demanded it. But the hatch wouldn't open. The emergency ascent beacon refused to launch. Our support ship on the surface no longer responded. We activated our backup buoy. No response. It was as if we were no longer in the ocean. Or perhaps the ocean was no longer where it had been. Miller proposed flooding the compartments, sinking the Mako again by brute force. But none of us could say what would happen if we tried. We feared sinking would no longer be descent, but rejection. that the Mako would not allow itself to go down again, not after all these years, that it would fight, that it would take us with it. That night, the mess hall changed again. This time, it was not rearranged. It was restored. Not to our configuration, but to 1943. Real fruit in the bowls. Silver utensils, not our titanium ones. A newspaper on the table, headline bold, Mako missing, hope fades. A crew photograph hung above the coffee urn. All 12 members smiling. I was among them, in the front row. I was not born until 1986. The depth gauge hit 47 meters. We hadn't moved, but the sea above us had. The light filtering through the top viewport, a viewport that was not supposed to exist, shimmered with the hue of dawn. Reyes began whispering, over and over. It wants to come back. I asked her what she meant. She didn't respond, only looked at me with eyes that no longer seemed hers. Behind her, the periscope rotated on its own. Not slowly, decisively. It locked onto a heading and clicked. A camera feed activated, but it did not show the surface. It showed a harbor. Gray, silent, familiar. A naval base, but wrong. No personnel, no ships. Only one figure standing on the pier, staring directly into the lens. Myself. I ran. To the reactor room. To the comms panel. I tried everything to disable the Mako's systems. Every circuit was hot. Every breaker inert. The ship was sealed not just in steel, but in intention. And that intention was singular. Ascend. Not escape. Return. Reyes said it first. It never sank. It was waiting. We all thought it was a weapon, a relic. But it was neither. It was a pilgrim. A thing buried too early, unfinished. Something that had not yet fulfilled its function. The crew had been incidental. The war had been noise. The Mako had always had its own mission. In the final hours, we gathered at the forward observation bay, a place we had never found before, now revealed. It faced up, toward the flickering dance of the sea ceiling. Through the glow, a shape descended. No, rose to meet us from below. A shadow of ourselves, another Mako, or perhaps our reflection, or future. I could no longer tell. Reyes turned to me and whispered, "We're not surfacing into our world." And in that moment, I believed her. Because the ocean above us no longer shimmered blue. It pulsed red. As we crossed the final 10 meters, I stopped fighting. I pressed my hand to the hull. It felt warm, familiar, alive. The countdown reached 0. No explosion, no rupture, just release. A long exhale. And then we broke through. Into air that had not existed for 80 years. Into light that had no sun. Into a sky filled with ships that should have never been built, bearing flags that never flew. And in the distance, across the waves, a fleet waited, silent, still, watching, as if they had been expecting our return.